Although Nixon wanted to revise America's Cold War strategy, his first priority was to get American troops out of the war in Vietnam. By 1969, this war had cost the lives of 30,000 GIs, and there was still no end.
When I became Secretary of Defense, there were 550,000 men on the ground in Vietnam, another 1,200,000 in Asia in the Navy and the Air Force supporting this operation. It was a big war.
America's ally, President Thieu of South Vietnam, met Nixon on Midway Island. Nixon told Thieu he planned to pull out American troops and hand over the ground war to the South Vietnamese.
Vietnamization was the term that I coined in order to get people thinking about the responsibilities the Vietnamese had there.
So we came in and said, that's fine as long as you leave behind a well-trained South Vietnamese army and equip us so that we could take care of our own destiny.
In July 1969, the first American troops were pulled out.
Both Nixon and Kissinger knew what it was doing to our society. The controversy, the distractions, the financial costs, the terrible human toll in terms of lives lost and wounded, not only of Americans, but Vietnamese and others, and also the distractions from other foreign policy initiatives. It's one reason that Nixon and Kissinger wanted to open up with China and to improve relations with Russia, partly to try to bring pressure on the Vietnamese to negotiate a settlement, partly to show a dramatic forward movement of our foreign policy that we were not crippled and paralyzed by the Vietnam War.
Hanoi had put on its own pressure with an offensive in the south. American generals proposed bombing North Vietnam's bases in neutral Cambodia. Nixon agreed to the bombing, but insisted the raids in Cambodia be kept secret.
Doors open at 30 TG. Can we up at 30 TG? Stand by to release. Ready now. Oh, I'm sorry. Time. Ready now.
I was all for bombing the sanctuaries in Cambodia, but I could not tell the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, or the National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, that I could keep it secret. And I thought it would be a very bad thing if that came out at a later time. And I knew it would, because we had 12,000 people that had all that information, and you just can't keep secrets.
Laird was right. Anti-war demonstrators protested. They called out the names of soldiers killed in Vietnam.
Richard Nixon could look out the window of the White House and see a mob of people marching in the street, protesting the war in Vietnam, for instance. He could take a 3x5 card out of his pocket and take a look. And the polls showed him with the confidence of 70–75% of the American people. And he'd say, I'm not going to let those people in the street make foreign policy for this country.
And so tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. I pledged in my campaign for the presidency to end the war in a way that we could win the peace. I have initiated a plan of action which will enable me to keep that pledge. The more support I can have from the American people, the sooner that pledge can be redeemed. For the more divided we are at home, the less likely the enemy is to negotiate.
Nixon believed, I think correctly, that the opposition to the war was mostly about the draft and the casualties and not about the American presence. The Americans didn't care if we were bombing Hanoi. They didn't care if there were American airplanes around. What they didn't like was the fact that young American men were being drafted, sent to Vietnam, and being killed.
The bombing of communist bases in Cambodia was no miracle cure.
Okay. 100 meters away from it now, Jesse from air.
American GIs still came under attack in South Vietnam.
All right, who's wounded? All right, give me some cover.
Can you move them? Okay, try and bring them back here. Remember to stop the bleeding. You gotta stop.
Nixon now ordered a ground assault into Cambodia.
Anybody out here?
Do you feel the people are united behind you, Mr. President?
As far as the people are concerned, I have no judgment on that. All that I can say is that I know that I did what I believed was right, and what really matters is, as far as the people are concerned, is whether it comes out right. If it comes out right, that's what really matters.
Leave this area immediately. Leave this area immediately.
Nixon's invasion of Cambodia produced violent protests on American campuses.
Ready position.
At Kent State University, National Guardsmen shot 4 students dead.
Every year, in the early spring and late autumn, the Soviet Army gets its new recruits. The forces are inconceivable without strong, agile men possessing stamina. These are fighting men.
Fighting men alone could not guarantee security. Soviet leaders wanted arms agreements that recognized their nuclear parity with America. They also wanted American understanding in their quarrel with China. The Communist Party chief, Leonid Brezhnev, championed relaxation of Cold War tension with America, the policy that would be called détente. He was on his way to the very top of Soviet power.
Brezhnev was a sincere person in many ways. He had been through the great patriotic war from beginning to end. He returned with the very strong conviction that he had to do his best to prevent war.
In March 1972, North Vietnam launched a new offensive in the south. Nixon responded with more air attacks. Would the Soviets receive Nixon in Moscow while his planes were bombing their North Vietnamese ally?
The general debate that took place in the White House Situation Room, and I was in many of these, was which is more important, the Vietnam front or the Moscow front? And Nixon was the only important person that I can recall who said we can have both. I'm willing to lose the Moscow summit, but I predict the Russians will go ahead even if we bomb Hanoi and mine Haiphong.
Nixon and Henry Kissinger played sort of good cop, bad cop with the Russians particularly. Kissinger would see Anatoly Dobrynin, the Russian ambassador, frequently, I mean, almost daily. And his line was, look, I work for this crazy man. There's no telling what he might do. So Anatoly, you and I, as reasonable men, must work together to an accommodation between our countries.
Kissinger was uncertain whether Moscow would allow the summit to go ahead.
I went to see Kissinger. He was nervous but tried to hide it. He said jokingly, "Okay, let's have a bet," because he knew I had a piece of paper with the official Soviet reply. He said, "Let's bet whether I can guess the answer." So we bet a crate of champagne. I asked him, "So what do you think the Soviet answer is?" He was convinced that the summit had been postponed to a later date. In fact, the official Soviet reply was, "The summit is going ahead, as planned."
May 22nd, 1972. Richard Nixon became the first serving American president to be received in the Kremlin. The summit reached agreements to limit offensive and defensive nuclear weapons, and it laid the foundation of détente. For Brezhnev and Nixon, this was the most dramatic proof yet of the new relationship between their two countries.
The atmosphere was very good, even friendly. We were quite aggressive in view of Nixon's actions on Vietnam, but we made sure it didn't overshadow the summit, because the issues that Nixon was going to raise had already been agreed through the confidential channel. These were very important nuclear issues. All the members of the Politburo knew that the text of the treaty had already been agreed. Nixon knew that too from Kissinger. So, if we gave in to our emotions, we would ruin everything that had already been achieved.
The President of the United States.
The American Congress gave Nixon a hero's welcome.
Last Friday in Moscow, we witnessed the beginning of the end of that era, which began in 1945. We took the first step toward a new era of mutually agreed restraint and arms limitation between the two principal nuclear powers. With this step, we have enhanced the security of both nations. We have begun to check the wasteful and dangerous spiral of nuclear arms, which has dominated relations between our two countries for a generation. We have begun to reduce the level of fear by reducing the causes of fear for our two peoples and for all peoples in the world.
In Vietnam, the 1973 peace accords had not stopped the fighting. By April 1975, South Vietnamese troops were struggling to defend Saigon against Hanoi's final offensive. They could expect little help from the Americans.
The Congress of the United States refused to supply the kind of military assistance that was necessary to keep the South Vietnamese military forces strong.
South Vietnamese who had fought and worked alongside the Americans against the communists besieged the U.S. Embassy. The Americans were getting away, but they had lost the war, and now they could not even save thousands of their South Vietnamese friends.
The American experience in Vietnam, and particularly my own, had been like a B-52 strike from 60,000 feet up. Oh, we'd done a lot of damage, but very seldom did you have to gaze upon the consequences of that damage. That last day was like being in a B-52 strike right on the deck. You saw what our actions had wrought, and the horror and the shame was almost more than you could bear.
In the Soviet Union, where memorials kept alive the remembrance of a terrible war, détente had few enemies. Soviet leaders hoped to guarantee their country's status and security with a treaty to be signed in Helsinki, which would recognize the post-war division of Europe. After overcoming the doubts of his colleagues, Brezhnev arrived in Helsinki, keen to cut a figure among leaders from East and West.
Людям, принадлежавшим поколению, которое пережило ужасы Второй мировой войны, особенно отчетливо виден исторический смысл настоящего совещания. Право на мир должно быть обеспечено всем народам Европы.
3, 2, engine sequence start. 1, 0, launch commit. We have a liftoff. All engines building up thrust.
Thanks to détente, rockets could now point the way to coexistence rather than war.
Houston flight, ЦУП Москва. Корабль «Союз» готов к стыковке.
Apollo Houston, I got 2 messages for you. Moscow is go for docking. Houston is go for docking. It's up to you guys.
Soviet and American spacecraft made history, docking together 140 miles above the Earth.
Contact.
All right.
In space, cooperation was replacing years of Cold War confrontation.
Glad to see you.
When we went to the United States for training, we met the Americans. I remember one of them saying to me, "Since this international project, I have begun to sleep better at night. I'm no longer afraid of nuclear war, because we are working together."